Now, another thing you should be familiar with respective to validation that's very common in the .NET framework and other parts of the framework are data annotations. Data annotations are a capability that comes in from a reference that you'll add to your project called System Component Model.Data Annotations. Data annotations are known by Entity Framework, ASP.NET, Silverlight RIA Services, and you can enable them in WPF very easily. First, what we're going to do is define a base class that we can put on our entities. And I'll call this entity base. And we're using this to encapsulate just the few lines of code that we need to evaluate data annotations. Specifically, there's a class called the validation context. You pass it a reference to the object that you're trying to validate. You set a property on it called member name to tell it what property is being evaluated. And then you use the validator class .validateProperty method, passing in the value that's being set on that property and the context object that you created up above that wraps the object being validated. Validate property is going to throw an exception if this value is not appropriate based on attributes that you can put on the properties. So this is basically some infrastructure that you need to get data annotation attributes evaluated. So let's go add some attributes. I'm going to comment out the validate phone method call here in the home phone property, and I'm going to add several data annotation attributes. So first off, I'm going to put a regular expression as one of the built-in attributes so that we can just declaratively put the regular expression that applies to this property right there where it's defined, instead of having to call out to some method and go see what that method does and write the regex code to evaluate it. Likewise, we could say this is a required field, and it will give a validation error if it's empty or null. We could give it a string length. If it was a numeric value, there's a range attribute. There's also a custom validation attribute that you can point to a method to encapsulate your own logic. So these are just a nice declarative way to put attributes on a property to indicate what the validation role associated with that property is. But attributes don't do anything unless some code goes and evaluates them. So that is why we put that entity base class in place. If we add entity base as a base class for our entity, and then in the property, we invoke that validate method. So we call validate property on our base class, passing in the property name and the value that's being set. That's going to trigger that code down in entity base to use the validation context and validator to basically reach back up to this property, pull off each of the data annotation attributes, execute them to find out if there's an error, and if so, throw an exception with those errors. So with that in place, we can go ahead and run, go to our home phone, exceed the string length, for example, tab out of the field, and we can see we get our field home phone must be a string with a maximum length of 12. So it even gives you a nice error string there based off of the attribute, and those are localizable. If you have some custom error you want, you can see that there are name parameters, including error message resource string and type if you're using resources for localization, and a minimum length. Now, one other thing to point out is if you don't want to do it with exceptions, now this is working because we have validate on exceptions on our binding. If you don't want to do it with exceptions, there's an alternative way on the validator class called try_validate_property. This will return a Boolean flag, and it will populate a collection of validation results with any errors that result. So you can integrate this with the IDataErrorInfo pattern to return the collection of strings that comes out of this if there was an error, instead of throwing an exception. I'm just going to leave it with the validate property here. But generally just throwing the exception and using validates on exceptions will work nicely. So that's all there is to using data annotations. Put the appropriate attributes on your properties, have the few lines of code invoked that get those data annotations evaluated.